Hello, everyone, and welcome to the RavenCast, a product of the Raven Foundation, which you can find at ravenfoundation.org, where we talk about mimetic theory, religion, current events, pop culture, and things like that. And we also, at ravenfoundation.org, have interviews. It's where we house the RavenCast. So we have multiple interviews like this one, but today I am so excited because we have Erik Buys with us. Hi, Erik.
Hi, Adam.
It's great to have you with us. Erik and I first met at a colloquium on violence and religion conference a long time ago, and we've been kind of seeing each other ever since at those colloquiums. And Erik, I must say, it's like I've known you forever. You're like an old, long-lost friend, and I'm so excited to have you here and to talk with you today.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you.
Erik is a high school history teacher at a Jesuit high school in Belgium, and he also writes at a website. Everything that Erik writes is fantastic. His website is called Mimetic Margins. And Erik does a lot of talking about mimetic theory and current events and pop culture and movies. And Erik has one of the best video introductions of mimetic theory that you will find anywhere on his website, Mimetic Margins. Highly encourage people to go check out Mimetic Margins. So, Erik, was that a good enough introduction of you? Anything else you want to?
Introduction. I'm really honored. I'm really honored with everything you said. Thank you.
Good. How is being a high school history teacher? You teach at a Jesuit high school and you teach some mimetic theory at the school. How is that going for you?
Well, actually, I teach religion.
Okay. Yeah.
So, well, it's not always easy. I mean,
yeah.
But I'm trying the best I can, and I think it's a matter of trial and error.
Yes.
You should ask my students about it.
Well, fortunately, we do have some of your students in the chat room. So, and everybody else in the chat room, you can write comments over there. It's on the left-hand side. So if you have questions or comments for Erik, feel free to write them there, and I will get them in. So, Erik, I wanted to bring you on in part because you have an upcoming book titled "Not Peace But a Sword: A Christian Provocation in Times of Facebook, ISIS, and Refugee Crises." This is quite you're talking about Christian provocation. In a time when I think Christians need to be a bit provocative. I mean, it's a great theme, and I want to know what compelled you to write this book.
Well, I first got the idea of writing the book when Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, he decided to stop thousands of refugees from leaving Hungary, and he claimed that he was defending European Christianity against the Muslim influx. He wrote a piece in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung where he claimed, and I will quote him, "We shouldn't forget that the people who are coming here grew up in a different religion and represent a completely different culture. Most are not Christian, but Muslim. That is an important question because Europe and European culture have Christian roots." So, of course, today we are confronted with acts of terrorism in the name of Islam. And this makes it rather easy to depict refugees from the Middle East as a potential threat to the stability of our society. So what I noticed was that Orban and many other European citizens and leaders, for that matter, they try to maintain peace and order by identifying supposed threats to that peace, and by suppressing, banning, or eliminating those threats. Of course, the reality is that the vast majority of refugees have nothing to do with terrorism. Actually, they're fleeing from terrorism. So that got me thinking. If you refer to the so-called Christian nature of your culture, you still justify these politics, because if you look at the way Jesus acts in the New Testament, whenever he is confronted with situations where peace is maintained at the expense of sacrifices, I think he does a different thing than Viktor Orban does.
Mm-hmm.
No, of course, the textbook example is Jesus' encounter with the adulterous woman, where we all know the story. You know, you have the scribes and the Pharisees coming to Jesus with his woman caught in the act of adultery, and they try to set up a trap for Jesus. So they say, you know, in the law, according to the law of Moses, we need to stone this adulterous woman. What do you think about it?
Mm-hmm.
And well, in the end, Jesus says you shouldn't stone the woman. Well, he says, let any one of you who is without sin cast the first stone. Okay. I wanna start with this story because it reveals many things, I think, and it also allows us to consider whether Viktor Orban is actually defending Christianity when he tries to maintain an order or a peace at the expense of some sacrifice. Well, first thing that the story reveals is, I think, the sexist nature of ancient Israel. You know, in ancient times, women are often depicted as dangerous, as causing all kinds of mayhem. It's not just a thing in Israel, but you know, also in Greek mythology, you have Pandora, who opens the box, and all the misery comes into the world, and all kinds of violent mayhem. And so we have this patriarchal tendency to blame women for potential situations of instability, because the reasoning is like, when a woman commits adultery, she raises tensions between men, and instead of blaming the men for the tensions, we blame the woman. So I mean, I have a quote here from the Greek poet Hesiod, who writes about Pandora. From her is the race of women and female kind. Of her is the deadly race and tribe of women, who live amongst mortal men to their great trouble. No helpmates in hateful poverty, but only in wealth.
Yeah.
Of course, sexism isn't just a thing from the past. It's still alive and kicking today. I just recently I read a report of the European campaign to end female genital mutilation, which says, and I quote, "Female genital mutilation, in particular infibulation, is defended as it is assumed to reduce a woman's sexual desire and lessen temptations to have extramarital sex, thereby preserving a girl's virginity." You know, so It's still something that goes on today. This is, of course, an extreme example. You know, in the Desanage tribe in Ethiopia, they believe that when a girl is not circumcised, that the whole tribe will perish. And it's defended as as something that is some sort of divine command also. If we don't obey to the gods of our culture, and if we don't circumcise our girls, we will perish. A girl that is not circumcised will be cast out from the tribe because she is considered a threat to the stability of that culture. And I wanted to give these examples to give a bit more context to what is actually happening when Jesus tries to change the attitude towards the woman caught in adultery.
It reminds me of a current event that is happening here in the United States with the confirmation of Jeff Sessions. And I'm sure you've heard that Elizabeth Warren stood up in front of Congress and gave a long speech reading Coretta Scott King, and the Republicans decided to silence her. So now, you know, people, whether or not that was sexist, Democrats are obviously going to claim that it was sexist, but it's this long tradition, human tradition of silencing the voice of women. And you see that in every culture. I think one of the great things about Jewish history is that you often hear the voice of women throughout the Bible. So you've got Ruth and Esther, and it's a minority voice, but it's at least a voice that gets in there. So there is this kind of subversive element of that happening within biblical tradition.
Yes, and I think in the Gospel of John, it contains, of course, the story of the adulterous woman. It's a very subversive story. And it's I guess what happens are three things, three important things in Jesus' reaction. First of all, he does not abolish the law. And he says that any one of you who is without sin cast the first stone. He implies that if you cast the first stone, then you're claiming that you are God, because be without sin in a Jewish mind frame, the one who is without sin is, of course, God. So if you cast the first stone, then you imply that you are God, right? Which is actually a trespassing of the first commandment. The most important commandment of the Jewish law. It's very important to notice that Jesus does not abolish the law. The second thing is that he questions the idea people have of themselves. And he says that any one of you who is without sin cast the first stone. He also implies that people should realize that they are not God. He actually says, you are not God. And if you realize that you are not God, and you get a more realistic idea of yourself, and you realize that you have more in common with that woman, then you might be able to love that woman, to respect that woman. So it's something, what I call the logic of Jesus. The logic of Jesus is, and I want to refer to his answer to a question by a lawyer. There is a lawyer who asks Jesus, of course, again to test him, which is the great commandment in the law? And Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. But to love God actually means that you do not consider anything to be divine, or anyone to be divine. So if you realize that, of course, you yourself aren't divine as well, you realize that, and so you respect the first commandment, then it follows that you can respect the second commandment. And Jesus continues, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Yourself as yourself. Indeed, I love myself because I'm not upholding an untruthful image of myself. Instead, I look at myself more as who I am, who I really am, meaning that I'm not perfect, that I'm a sinner too, that I make mistakes, that I have my weaknesses, and by realizing that I have my weaknesses, I open up to others who also have weaknesses. Weaknesses. So I love my neighbor as myself. So the scandal of Jesus is that he reveals that I have more in common with my enemy than that I differ from my enemy. So yeah, well, you know, I heard a story about it's something that really happened at a retreat. A retreat for couples. There was a 36-year-old man, and at the retreat there were also like younger people who took care of the kids while the parents were like doing their exercises and whatever. And at a certain point, there was a man, a 36-year-old man, and he was writing. It was a conversation in writing, writing to a younger woman who was also present, taking care of the kids normally, but they were writing to each other. And at a certain point, he said, "I think I'm falling in love with you." And well, the conversation went on a bit, and the girl ended up saying, "Well, I think you should tell your wife." Okay, the man took their conversation and left it at the room that he shared with his wife. Later on, during the evening, his wife went to their room, found the conversation, read the conversation, went back to the room where they were all present, run over to her husband, and hugged him. Might have strangled him, but no, she started hugging his wife. She started hugging her husband. Sorry, and he was surprised. He said, "What are you doing? I thought you would be angry. You would be disappointed with me." And she said, "You know, do you really think that in all of our years together that I've never had similar experience, that there wasn't some man that I thought, yeah, he's also fascinating, and maybe if things would have been different, I could have shared my life with him," and so on. So what happens there is, instead of using the weakness of her husband to gain power over him, to because it's easy to manipulate someone when you can make them feel guilty or when you can make them feel ashamed. So instead of using that weakness, she became aware of her own weaknesses. And that allowed her to forgive her husband. And so that's the same thing as realizing that I am not without sin, so I don't cast the first stone. So I can show mercy instead of sacrificing someone. And what happened was the couple, they started talking, and they had a conversation that they hadn't had for a long time, and they really became happy during that conversation. At some point, the younger woman came in. She saw them, and she wanted to walk out again, but instead the woman said, "Come here, it's okay, it's okay." And they hugged each other, and life went on. But what would happen if the guy came up to his wife and said, "I'm falling in love. I fell in love with a younger woman." If she would use that to manipulate her husband might try to defend himself by blaming the girl, the younger woman. Like he might come up with a story that she seduced him, and then you're in scapegoat modus again. You blame someone else for what happens, and you try to defend an untruthful image of yourself. That's the thing. If you love an untruthful image of yourself, then the consequence is that you cannot respect and love others. I noticed this with myself as well. At some point, my high school girlfriend, when I was still in high school, she came up to me and she said, "I think I'm a bit, I have feelings for that guy. Don't you ever doubt our relationship?" And of course I said, "No, are you crazy? That's not normal, because you are afraid. And then the other person is ashamed and feels guilty and so on, and instead of allowing the weakness of the other, you give him a sense of guilt, and I think then the evil will start to boil like something that will erupt eventually.
Yeah, your book, Not Peace But a Sword, is based in part on a great article you wrote on mimetic margins called Jesus Christ Narcissist. And I've got so many questions about that article, but the thing that you just said reminds me of a point that you make in the article that says something like, we don't live in a perfect world. None of us are perfect. We're all going to make mistakes. And since we don't live in a perfect world, we need to live in relationships of mutual forgiveness and mutual acceptance. And hearing you tell that story is just such a profound story about that point. How can you accept ourselves, our own emotions, our own thoughts and feelings when they always seem to come with a sense of shame? The reason that I'm like, that if I ever had feelings for another woman, that I wouldn't want to talk with them to my wife, was because I would feel a sense of shame about it. But if you're open about these things and some amount of vulnerability, you're not afraid of being vulnerable about them, they can do a lot of repairing of relationships.
And so, yeah, repairing, or you always run the risk that something else might happen.
Right.
Yeah, but the thing is, if you respect the other, then you should give him the possibility of picking up his or her own mind. So what Jesus does is, when he acts out of love, he does it without being dependent on the outcome. So it's not that he wants to serve. He will love independent of whether it makes him loved or not. So and that's also something that we might talk about a little later on. But to come back to your question about shame, well, there are two types of shame, I think. The first type of shame is, I'll tell you yet another story. When I was in high school, when I started, when I was like 11 years old, 12 years old, I had to take the bus from my little town where I used to go to my primary school. So I had to take the bus, and on that bus there was a boy who I went to school with. But I knew him. He wasn't really a friend of mine. I knew him a little bit, but what I noticed was that in the bus, the cool dudes, they were all in the back of the bus. So if you wanted to have a fulfilled life, if you wanted to get to heaven, then you had to get to reach the end of the bus. Then you were a cool dude. Then you're. I mean, so, and after a few months, I got to know some people, and I was one of the cool dudes in the back of the bus. So what I noticed was that my fellow, the boy that I knew from primary school, he wasn't popular with the cool dudes in the back of the bus. He wasn't bullied, but he was not one of the gang. So what I noticed was that at first I said hi to him, but after a few months I didn't even bother to say hi to him anymore. Because, I mean, that wasn't really part of my image.
You're a cool kid now.
Yeah, I was a cool kid, yeah. So, years later, I thought about this when I read the betrayal, the denial of Peter. So Peter, he says, I will never abandon you, Jesus. You can count on me. I will never betray you. And Jesus says, well, you think you're a hero, but when push comes to shove? Is that the expression? You will abandon me. So, and indeed, Jesus is arrested, tortured, will be crucified, and the people come up to Peter and they say, do you know that Jesus? And Peter says, no, I don't know him. So he wants to protect his image. And because he wants to protect his image, he dissociates himself from his friend. And then he does everything that Jesus. He does the opposite of Jesus. Jesus is the one who always takes sides with those who are marginalized, and yeah, Peter could not resist the temptation to choose for his image.
To save his image. Yeah, this gets back to the narcissist question that you bring up in your article. Jesus Christ, narcissist, with a question mark. And the first time I came across this was when I was in college, and I was a religious studies major, and an atheist professor gave me a book that was titled The Power Tactics of Jesus Christ. And this was the first time that I came across the argument that Jesus was a narcissist. And you talk about this, you build up this argument really well to deconstruct it later on in your paper. What are the arguments that Jesus was a narcissist? Because a lot of people are surprised. Yeah, a lot of people are surprised when they hear this argument a lot of times by atheists that Jesus was a narcissist. How do they make that argument?
I think Friedrich Nietzsche, is a good way of entering that question. In ancient times, people who were sick, who were poor, who were unfortunate, they were considered that they were cursed by the gods. So if you grow up in a culture where when you're not doing well, that people say, well, yeah, you have to accept it because that's a curse of the gods. And then there comes a guy around who says, well, you're sick, you're poor, the people say all kinds of bad things about you, but the true God, well, he loves you. He's on your side. So what Jesus does, seems to do, is using the weakness of people, like their low self-esteem, people with low self-esteem, and telling them that, well, you are loved by God, and he becomes popular because of that. So you might say that he seduces weak minds, and to make himself more popular, and that he needs the approval of followers, that he needs to make himself popular, and so on and so on. And at a certain point, you could argue that he is abandoned by everybody. Still, then he invents, or then he is really convinced that God is on his side. I mean, I don't need the approval of anyone. I am such a genius. God is on my side, and I'm prepared to sacrifice myself for my friend. And atheists would say, so Jesus is a masochist who sacrifices himself to gain the recognition of his imaginary friend, who is a sadist.
Yes. His imaginary daddy, his father.
Yeah, his imaginary daddy. So he craves recognition, and when he doesn't get the recognition, he creates this divine being, this idea that there is a God who gives him the attention and the recognition and the acknowledgement that he truly deserves. So that's one way of approaching Jesus.
From a particular point of view, it makes some sense.
Yeah, well, and it makes sense if you, well, until you read the Gospels, I think.
Yes. You actually claim in your article that Jesus was not a narcissist. Why? How can you make this claim?
Yeah, well, the narcissist is someone who is actually not fond of himself. A narcissist, as weird as it may sound, is someone who does not love himself. He loves an untruthful idea of himself. He thinks of himself highly. it's so. And what happens with Peter? We were talking about Peter. Peter discovers that he thought of himself as a hero, and Peter discovers the truth about himself. And at first Peter is ashamed of himself, and in the end, Peter is ashamed because he did not give the love that his friend in need needed. So there are two types of shame. Something I learned from the Jesuits, the discernment of spirits. The Jesuits, Ignatius, he has these exercises, and their aim is to allow people to think about the sources of their grief, of their anger, and so on. So the narcissist is actually ashamed of himself. The narcissist is a masochist in a certain sense. And the narcissist, being a masochist, has the tendency of sacrificing who he really is to an idea that will please others, that will gain the recognition of others. But the reason I think why Jesus is not a narcissist is that he, first of all, what we said earlier, he questions the narcissism of others. Of course, if it's not because you see the narcissism of others that you yourself wouldn't be a narcissist. But that's the first observation. He questions the untruthful ideas people have of themselves. Second, he questions those ideas not to make himself popular with the downtrodden or the people who are marginalized, because very often he does not want people to follow him. I think of the story about the Gerasene demoniac. So there is this guy, and he is possessed by a demon, and the crowd, the people of his town, they try to control him, but they cannot control him because he's possessed by this demon. And Jesus asks him, "Who are you?" And the demon says, "I am Legion, for we are many." And also, the demoniac is someone who throws stones at himself, who hurts himself with stones. And third, the demoniac is someone who lives in the graveyard. So being possessed by a demon or being possessed by the devil seems to mean that you are hurting yourself, you're not respecting yourself, you have more than one identity. And this makes sense, because the Gerasene demoniac seems to look at himself through the eyes of a crowd, of his community, and this community seems not to accept him. So that's why he's stoning himself, and to stone yourself is actually an imitation of a stoning by a multitude, by a community. So the way he looks at himself is an imitation of the way other people look at him. So he's not able to respect himself. He thinks, I'm a bad person or whatever. Second, he has different identities. That also makes sense, because if you live because you want to gain recognition of others, then I might ask myself, what should I do to gain the recognition of Adam? And then in comes someone else who is totally different from Adam, but I want to gain his recognition also. So I become this other person. And so it goes on until I'm totally dependent on the recognition I get from others, and I'm all these different types of persons. So I don't respect myself. I have these multiple identities, and also I'm, in a sense, I'm dead. That's why it says that the demoniac lives in the graveyard. He is in the realm of death. The letter of John, it says that the one who does the one who is not loved is still in the realm of death. So that also makes sense, because my identity that I have with Adam has to go when someone else comes in. So I'm in this constant situation of peril, and you know, and what Jesus does is he seems to allow the demoniac to come to his senses. So he allows the demoniac to come to himself. The demoniac is no longer dependent on the recognition he either gets or doesn't get from his community. But then a very interesting thing happens. You could say that, well, Jesus is the big hero who saved the community from their problem. But the story ends and the community says, go away. I mean, what kind of thing is that, to say that he is the one who cured this crazy person, and who seemed to have saved the community from this big problem, and I just say, move away, get away from here. Well, what he does is, you could say that the Kerosene demoniac was some sort of common enemy who brought unity to the community. But if this common problem, this common enemy is gone, then all kinds of different tensions might arise. It's like the town's crazy person who enters the bar, and there were some arguments in the bar, but then the town's crazy guy comes in, and we can all have some fun with that same crazy person. But if that crazy person isn't crazy anymore, it just comes in, and the tensions wouldn't go away. So that's what Jesus says. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. And person's enemies will be those of his own household. So that makes sense. Because he also says, love your enemy. And he also says, peace I leave with you. My peace, meaning, he says, not as the world do I give to you. My peace is not of this world. And then it all comes together. Because if you love the external enemy of your own group, then you criticize, you question your idea of your former enemy, and then you create tensions within your own group. Well, that person that we hate is not that bad. Right. And so you get these discussions within your own group. So when Jesus says, I did not come to bring peace but a sword, and a person's enemies will be those of his own household, he can also say, love your enemy, and I will leave you a peace that is not of this world. So, and in the end, the Kharizim demoniac, asks if he can join Jesus, and Jesus says, "No, go back to your household." And so there is this responsibility of the community to accept their former common enemy. So that reveals that Jesus is not someone who wants the recognition of this former victim. He's not a narcissist craving the acknowledgement of that weak person, but instead he wants to make possible a new kind of relationship within that community. And if Jesus is popular, it is because it is a consequence of what he does. It is not his ultimate goal, and that's a very important point. Jesus is not someone who wants to get into some kind of heaven. I mean, that's not his ultimate goal. If he is popular, it's just a consequence of what happens. But regardless of the consequences, he would still do what he does.
Which is to stand with the scapegoats, the victims of society. You make this great point in your paper that when you take that position, when you stand with the scapegoats, you are likely to become the scapegoat yourself.
And also what's very Jesus was approached by his adversaries as a narcissist. I mean, there is this story. The Pharisees, in Matthew 22. I will read it. It's just fast. The Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap Jesus in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. "Teacher," they said, "we know that you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not?" Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, "You hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax." They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, "Whose image is this, and whose inscription?" "Caesar's," they replied. Then he said to them, "So give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." Well, that's actually a thing. They think that Jesus is a narcissist, and they think, well, now we got him, because he wants to be popular one way or the other. And if he answers, we shouldn't pay taxes, then they can go to the Romans and say, this guy is against the Roman the Roman rule, and so we can get rid of him. But if he says we should pay taxes, then they can go to the common people, then they can go to the Jewish people and say, well, your Jesus, he's a collaborator with the Romans. So Jesus understands that they approach him from that angle, and just simply says, I'm not interested in getting any acknowledgement or any reward or any approval. That's not my thing. I'm not choosing one side or the other. The source that I live by is love, which is not dependent on whatever outcome. I always try to explain this story by by referring to the situation where sometimes you have students when they start off in high school, they're very good. They're very, they do whatever you ask them to do, and they learn their lessons and whatever. And they get good grades. But they learn because they want to get good grades. So when they get in the third year, things get a bit more complicated. You also have to understand what you are learning. And sometimes it doesn't work anymore. So instead of getting the approval of their teachers, some of the teachers, they say you should work harder, or the parents they start to complain you should work harder, and so on and so on and so on. But so in the fourth grade, they really get frustrated because the approval they got in their first years of high school, they don't get that approval anymore. And so instead of trying to get the approval of their parents and their teachers, they start focusing on maybe getting the approval elsewhere. If I'm a loser in the eyes of my teachers and the parents, well, and the school system, well, actually, it's a dumb system. I don't need that system. I don't need the approval of my parents and the teachers. That's a nerdy thing. And then the former nerd becomes is the word right? A dipshit?
Dipshit, yes.
He becomes someone who is against the system and who tries to get the approval of his fellow classmates and whatever. So that's actually maybe the situation. Are you a nerd, or are you a dipshit? Do you want to get the approval of the ruler, those who are the rulers, those who are in charge of the system, or do you want to get the approval of those who are against the system? But anyway, it's the system which defines your identity. And I guess that is what happens with the ISIS, many of the ISIS warriors. They grew up in a society where they want to belong to, and of course we are in Facebook times. That means that we are presented with all these models that we should follow, that we should imitate, and we try to reach the goals that others have. We create for ourselves because we imitate others. But if we get the feeling that we cannot reach those goals, one possible reaction is that you say, well, I don't need it. I'm against the system. And all those others, well, I'm feeling sorry for them, or that's resentment. That's what Nietzsche really is. That's one of the great things about Nietzsche, that he described resentment in such a sharp way. So many ISIS fighters are obsessed by what they are fighting against, and research highly suggests that they grew up in a culture and they wanted to belong to that culture, but they felt rejection. Because they felt rejection, they created a counterculture where where they can feel like we are the winners and we have God on our side. Well, we get the recognition of God, and the crazy thing is, nowadays we have learned that it's a shame to be a victim of that decadent culture. Like the ISIS fighter claims that he and other Muslims are victims. But the paradoxical thing is, we are victims of Western culture, but it's an honor to sacrifice ourselves. It's a disgrace to be a victim, but it's an honor to sacrifice yourself to defend your own identity, your own sense of self, which is very strange because you kill yourself because you might get eradicated by your enemy. So you kill yourself.
It reminds me of one of the great statements that you make about Jesus saying, "I did not come to bring peace, but the sword." You make it very succinctly, and it's one of the best mimetic analyses that I have seen about this. You write that Jesus favors nonviolent conflict in order to end violent peace. It's this piece that it's just a brilliant analysis. And I encourage people to go read the paper on mimetic margins. But we've got a couple of comments in the chat room that I want to get in. We've got a couple minutes left. LSBW makes a comment: letting a person be independent of the judgment of the community is again about taking away shame, in my opinion, and about acceptance of your own self, including your weaknesses. I don't know if you have a response to that, Erik, or...
Well, I think it goes to the very core of Christianity, meaning that your identity is not defined by social environment. So you are not the nerd you're not a nerd, you're not a dipshit. So you don't need to sacrifice yourself, and if you don't need to sacrifice yourself, you don't need to sacrifice others. I think that is why, well, in a nutshell, I think Christianity, Christ tries to save us from narcissism, from the need to sacrifice ourselves to an untruthful image of ourselves, from the need, from the shame we have for ourselves. And if we are no longer ashamed of ourselves, then we can be responsible towards other people as well. We don't need to sacrifice ourselves. We don't need to sacrifice others. Big difference between an ISIS fighter and Jesus is that Jesus did not sacrifice himself.
Right.
Jesus, well, he refused to defend himself because he knew that he said, "My kingdom is not of this world, because if my kingdom were of this world, I would have called my followers to start a civil war." Well, he's not Muammar Gaddafi who starts a civil war, because he refuses sacrifices. And he loves regardless of the consequences, even if others don't love him back, don't return his love. He still loves, and that's his freedom. That's why we say that God is all-powerful. Some atheists say, "What do you do? God is all-powerful." Yeah, but what God are you talking about? If you define God as love, then that means that you are not you are not in control. You cannot manipulate love. So it's a very to say that God is all-powerful in a Christian sense means that you have the power to love. That love manifests itself independent of the consequences. Meaning, yeah, you can save others, but you cannot save yourself.
Yeah, Yeah, we generally think of the all power of God as God being arbitrarily able to do whatever the hell God wants to do.
Yeah, like some wizard. But the real miracle, if you read the miracle stories, the miracle is not that Jesus can like manipulate nature and the natural forces and whatever. He's not in control. Um, the real miracle is that he that he is concerned about people who do not belong to your own group and so on. I mean, if I tell the story about that woman who forgives her man for falling in love with the younger woman, well, that's the miracle. Well, that's something to think about. I mean, I forgive. Um, I forgive the trespasses of others because I realize forgive my trespasses like forgive those who trespass against you and lead us not into temptation. But what is the temptation? The temptation is that you use the weakness of others to gain control, to gain power. That is the temptation to want power, to want to manipulate things, to gain control. Well, if Jesus were a narcissist, he would try to manipulate the love of others. He would try to get recognition and whatever. But that's the whole point. He sees the weaknesses of others, but he does not give in to the temptation to use their weaknesses to gain power over other people. So lead us not into temptation. It's not a coincidence that it comes behind and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, meaning that we are not led into the temptation to abuse their weaknesses to gain power.
We've excellent. We're over our time. I want to end with one last question, but we've got a couple of comments in the chat room that I just want to throw out there. We've got one from Robin Waitons. She says hello to you, Erik, and she brings up the topic of free speech, which I actually think has something to do with what we're talking about. Absolutely, with a very conservative provocateur named Milo Yiannopoulos, who was recently at UC Berkeley, and he's a big Trump supporter, and many progressives went out and protested him being at UC Berkeley, and the protest got a little violent and stopped him from giving this speech. He's a bit of the progressives' demoniac, I would think. And Robin is asking, isn't free speech a human right? And this gets back to our discussion about silencing certain people. It's this kind of distinction between, I think people would see Yiannopoulos as doing hate speech. There's a difference between hate speech and freedom of speech. And if you have any quick thoughts about that situation.
Yeah, well, the thing is, if I think about Ignatius and the discernment of spirits, the question is not free speech or not free speech. The question is not, should I wear a veil or shouldn't I wear a veil? The question is not, am I getting good grades or not? The question is, what is the source of what you are doing? Are you using free speech to manifest yourself, manifest a certain idea of yourself? I mean, it's really strange that some people, when they are confronted with like a Muslim who is like not a terrorist, then they say, well, he's not a real Muslim. Because I need the Muslim to be this terrorist in order to to manifest, to have an identity. The scandalous thing is that the other is more like me. So the question is, what are you using the free speech for? I think that's an important question. And also regarding Trump, President Trump is within ourselves. We are like Trump. I think we should become more aware of that maybe we should think about Trump as, well, maybe today we have a lot in common with him. The way he reacts, the way he uses Facebook, the way the way he reads things very, very quickly. He doesn't take time to analyze things. Well, maybe we're living in a time like that, and that maybe I'm also a bit shallow on many things.
He's a product of our culture, and that was the last question that I wanted to ask you, because you have a great article. Your latest article on mimetic margins is called "The Trump Reflex," and you explain this beautifully on that article. So I would encourage people to go check it out. The last comment is from Kristen Impens, and I think she makes this comment slightly humorously, but also there's some seriousness to it. She says, "Just a message. Women, with their ancient tradition of being a perfect servant," smiley face, "are the best partner to pick up swords to fight against a narcissistic society." What do you think?
I think the classical scapegoats, they can open up some perspectives. I think that's very important. Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, hey, Erik, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a fantastic conversation. Really enjoyed it. And and thank you everybody for joining us in the chat room with your comments and questions. I'll tell you, we even had somebody in the chat room named Demoniac from Satanville. So that's fun. Thank you for being with us, Demoniac from Satanville. And if you want to keep up with Erik, how can people find you, contact you?
Through my website, possible, or otherwise, my email is Erik Buys, one word, Erik with a K, at erikbuys3@gmail.com.
Excellent. Yeah, check out Erik's website, Mimetic Margins, and you can keep up with the Raven Foundation, with the Raven Review at ravenfoundation.org. We've got a Facebook page, and we've also got a special RavenCast Facebook page that you can join and see upcoming conversations. Next week, my colleague Suzanne is going to be talking with Grant Kaplan about his latest book. I can't remember the name. It's up here in my bookshelf. But Grant has this great book that was just released about truth and Christianity. They're going to talk about alternative facts and Christianity and truth. So join us next week for that live conversation next Thursday. You can find out more information on the Raven Facebook page. So you can find us on iTunes. Please leave a comment there, rate us on iTunes and on Stitcher. So hope that you can join us next week. Until then, thank you for being with us, and grace and peace be with you. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Peace.